The businessman kept the boarding pass from that flight in his wallet next to the picture of his daughter. It reminds me to look deeper, he would tell people. To see the person, not just my assumptions about them. And somewhere in Afghanistan, a young girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor was studying hard, not knowing that her story of survival had become part of something much bigger, a reminder that our shared humanity is stronger than any differences that might divide us. The staff surgeon's simple act of responding to prejudice with dignity had created a ripple effect that continued to touch lives, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of understanding on a routine flight home. The flight was nearing its end, but the story was just beginning to spread. During the final hour of the journey, the businessman had been typing furiously on his phone, documenting everything that had happened. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, trying to capture not just the events, but the profound change he had experienced. "I need to share this," he said, looking up from his phone. "People need to hear what happened today." The staff surgeon smiled gently, noticing how different his voice sounded now, humble, thoughtful, completely transformed from his earlier arrogance. The young girl had fallen asleep in her seat, clutching a small paper airplane the staff surgeon had made for her. Her mother looked over with grateful eyes. "My daughter will remember this day for the rest of her life," she said softly. She learned more about respect and courage in these few hours than she could have from any book. As the plane began its descent, passengers started exchanging contact information. The businesswoman who had mentioned her company's veteran program was deep in conversation with the older gentleman, discussing ways to expand opportunities for service members returning to civilian life. "You know," the businessman said, addressing the entire cabin, "I almost missed my flight today. I was angry about a delayed meeting, rushing to catch this plane." He paused, shaking his head at the memory. "Now I realize being late was the best thing that could have happened to me. It put me here, in this moment, where I could learn this valuable lesson." The flight attendant who had handled the initial confrontation came by to prepare for landing. "The crew and economy has been hearing about what happened up here," he shared. "Word travels fast on an airplane. People are already asking for the full story." The staff surgeon's phone buzzed. The businessman's social media post had already started gaining attention. His sincere account of his prejudice, the revelation about her service, and the transformation that followed was striking a chord with readers. Comments and shares were multiplying by the minute. "This is going to reach so many people," someone said, scrolling through their own phone. "It's exactly the kind of story people need to hear right now." The captain announced their final approach, and as the plane descended through the clouds, sunlight streamed through the windows. The businessman looked out at the golden light and then back at the staff surgeon. "I've been thinking," he said. "Would you be willing to help me develop a training program for my company, not just about diversity, but about real leadership, the kind you showed today?" Before she could respond, the businesswoman jumped in. "Make it a joint program. My company would benefit from this too. We could create something that really changes how people think and act." The plane touched down smoothly, and as passengers began gathering their belongings, the impact of the day's events continued to ripple outward. The airline's social media team had picked up the story, sharing it with their millions of followers. #FirstClassHumility was trending. A week later, the staff surgeon received an invitation to speak at a national conference about leadership and understanding. The businessman had already been booked as the introduction speaker, ready to share his story of transformation. The young girl wrote a school essay about that day on the plane, which her teacher later shared at a parent-teacher conference as an example of valuable life lessons. The essay eventually made its way to the local newspaper. The airline took notice too. They expanded their military appreciation program and implemented new staff training protocols based on what had happened. Flight attendants began sharing the story during their customer service training sessions. 3 months after the flight, the staff surgeon stood on a stage, looking out at a sea of faces. The businessman sat in the front row, along with the young girl and her mother, the older gentleman, and several of the other passengers from that memorable flight. She was about to deliver a keynote speech about breaking down barriers and building understanding. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was the quieter one, the countless conversations that started because of this story. In break rooms and living rooms, at dinner tables and office meetings, people began talking about their own prejudices and how to overcome them. The staff sergeant smiled warmly. "We are," she replied. "We're part of a moment where people chose to learn and grow instead of staying stuck in their assumptions. That's always important." As she finished speaking, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing some light turbulence ahead. But somehow, in that first-class cabin, the brief bumps seemed insignificant compared to the bonds that had formed and the understanding that had grown. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the staff sergeant found herself deep in thought. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly, creating a cozy atmosphere that encouraged conversation. She took a small sip of the coffee the flight attendant had brought her, thinking about how to address what had happened in a way that would bring people together rather than divide them further. She noticed the businessman watching her anxiously from his seat, clearly still processing his own behavior and its implications. Making a decision, she stood up carefully and addressed the first-class cabin. Her voice was warm but carried the natural authority that came from years of leadership experience. "If you'll allow me," she began, "I'd like to share something about my unit in Afghanistan." The other passengers immediately gave her their full attention. The flight attendants paused their service, sensing the importance of the moment. "In my unit, we had people from every background you can imagine," she continued. "We had soldiers who grew up in big cities and others from tiny rural towns. Some came from wealthy families, others from modest beginnings. We had different religions, different political views, different life experiences." The young girl who had asked about the rescue mission earlier was now sitting cross-legged in her seat, completely absorbed. Her mother had put away the in-flight magazine to listen as well. "But you know what happened when we were out there, facing challenging situations?" The staff sergeant's eyes swept across the cabin. None of those differences mattered. What mattered was that we could trust each other. We learned that the strength of our unit came from our diversity. Different perspectives helped us solve problems in ways we never could have alone. The businessman nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. He pulled out his phone and started taking notes as if he was in an important business meeting. That night during the rescue mission, she continued, her voice softening with the memory, everyone brought something unique to the table. One soldier knew the local terrain because he'd grown up in similar mountain conditions. Another had medical training from her time as a civilian nurse. Someone else had experience with rough weather from working on fishing boats. The older gentleman who had initially spoken up about the mission nodded in agreement, adding, "The best teams are always the ones that bring different strengths together." The staff sergeant smiled at him before continuing. But what really made it work was that we had learned to look past our first impressions of each other. We had learned to see the person, not just the surface. A flight attendant who had been listening nearby quietly wiped a tear from her eye. The businessman looked down at his expensive suit, then back at the staff sergeant's uniform, seeming to understand something profound about snap judgments and their consequences. "You know what's interesting?" the staff sergeant added, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "When you're in a tough situation, you stop seeing differences. You just see fellow human beings who need each other. That little girl we rescued, she didn't care about anyone's background. She just knew there were people trying to help her." The young girl in the cabin raised her hand as if she was in school. "Did you be scared?" she asked simply. The staff sergeant's face softened at the question. "Yes, we were all scared," she admitted honestly. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done anyway. And it's much easier to be brave when you have people you trust standing beside you, no matter who they are or where they come from." The businessman stood up suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. I've spent years judging people based on what I thought they should be, rather than who they are." His admission was raw and honest. "Today has taught me more than any corporate training ever could." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. The staff sergeant noticed several passengers discreetly wiping their eyes, touched by the genuine moment of reflection and connection. "The beautiful thing about understanding," she continued, "is that it spreads. Each person who learns to look past their first impressions can teach others to do the same. Every time we choose to see the person instead of our assumptions about them, we make the world a little bit better." The flight attendant, who had initially helped resolve the seating situation, approached with fresh coffee for everyone. "I've been flying this route for 12 years," he said, "and I've never seen passengers connect like this. It's like we're all part of something important." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had completely changed. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had transformed into something extraordinary. The businessman's offer to switch seats hung in the air, but the staff surgeon graciously declined with a warm smile. "Thank you, sir, but please keep your seat," she said kindly. "Sometimes the best view isn't out the window, but in the connections we make with each other." Her words carried no bitterness, no resentment for his earlier behavior. Other passengers began sharing their own stories, almost as if a dam had broken. A quiet lady in row 4 spoke up about her son, who was currently serving in the Navy. Her voice filled with pride as she talked about his recent letters home. An elderly man mentioned his service in the Gulf War and how the military had changed so much since then. The young girl who had been watching everything unfold finally gathered her courage and walked up to the staff sergeant. "Did the little girl from your story get better?" she asked, her eyes full of curiosity and concern. Her mother started to call her back, but the staff sergeant knelt down to the child's level. "Yes, she did," the staff sergeant replied softly. "In fact, last I heard, she's going to school now and wants to become a doctor." The girl's face lit up with a bright smile. The businessman reached into his briefcase and pulled out something unexpected, a small photo album. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "This is my daughter," he said, showing a picture to the staff sergeant. "She's in medical school now. When you mentioned that young girl wanting to become a doctor, I just..." His voice cracked slightly. The flight attendants, who had been discreetly watching this transformation, began their final preparations for takeoff. One of them brought fresh coffee to both the staff sergeant and the businessman, a small gesture of appreciation for the moment of understanding they were witnessing. The older gentleman who had shared the story of the rescue mission pulled out his phone and showed everyone a photo from a military ceremony. "This was taken right after that mission," he explained. "Look at how muddy everyone was. But notice the smiles. That's what happens when you know you've made a real difference." More passengers gathered around to look at the photo. In it, a group of soldiers stood together, their uniforms caked with mud, but their faces showing unmistakable joy and relief. The staff sergeant stood in the center, looking much younger but with the same determined look in her eyes. A businesswoman who had been quietly working on her laptop closed it and joined the conversation. "My company has a veteran hiring program," she said thoughtfully. "But I never really understood what these men and women go through until today. I'm going to recommend expanding it when I get back to the office." The businessman, who had been listening intently to everyone's stories, suddenly stood up again. "I run quarterly leadership seminars for my sales team," he said, his voice carrying a new humility. "We talk about courage and decision-making, but," he looked at the staff sergeant, "would you consider speaking at one of our events? Your story, it puts everything into perspective." The cabin crew began their final checks, but the sense of community didn't diminish. Passengers who had been strangers just minutes ago were now exchanging contact information, sharing more stories, and making plans to stay in touch. The young girl had returned to her seat, but kept glancing back at the staff sergeant with admiration. Her mother was explaining something about service and sacrifice, using words that a child could understand. The girl nodded seriously, clearly processing this important lesson about not judging others. Even as the captain announced their imminent departure, the warmth in the cabin remained. The businessman turned to the staff sergeant one last time. "I've learned more about leadership in the past 20 minutes than in 15 years of corporate seminars," he admitted. "Thank you for your patience with me. And more importantly, thank you for your service." The staff sergeant smiled, thinking about how a simple flight home had turned into something so meaningful. Around her, strangers had become friends, prejudices had melted away, and understanding had grown in place of assumptions. As the plane began to taxi, she noticed the businessman typing something on his phone. Later, she would learn that he was writing a long post about his experience, a post that would go viral and touch thousands of lives. But for now, she simply sat back, grateful for how a moment of confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for growth and connection. The older gentleman who had spoken up wasn't finished yet. As other passengers settled back into their seats, he moved closer to the staff sergeant, his eyes showing a mix of respect and recognition. That mission in Kandahar, he began, his voice carrying the weight of shared experience. It was during the spring offensive, wasn't it? The staff sergeant's eyes widened slightly with recognition. Yes, sir, she replied, her voice steady but touched with emotion. The thunderstorm season. We could barely see through the rain that night. The businessman, who had been about to sit down, paused. Despite himself, he found he was listening intently. Around them, other passengers leaned in slightly, drawn into this unexpected story unfolding in the first-class cabin. I was the operations coordinator at base that night, the older gentleman continued, speaking not just to the staff surgeon now, but to everyone within earshot. When the call came in about civilians trapped in the medical facility, most thought it was too risky to attempt a rescue. The weather was terrible, and we had reports of hostile activity in the area. A flight attendant passing by slowed her preparations, clearly caught up in the story. The young girl who had been watching earlier now sat on her knees in her seat, completely forgotten her tablet game. But this staff sergeant, he gestured respectfully. She didn't hesitate. She looked at the weather reports, calculated the risks, and came up with a plan that none of us had considered. She knew that the storm clouds would actually provide cover from any hostile forces. The businessman sank slowly into his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine interest. His phone lay forgotten in his lap as he listened. The facility held 12 people, the older gentleman continued. 3 were critical care patients, including an 8-year-old girl who needed emergency surgery. There were 2 doctors, 4 nurses, and 3 security personnel. All of them had been cut off when the bridge to the main hospital was damaged in the storm. The staff sergeant stood quietly, her posture perfect but her eyes distant, clearly seeing that night again in her mind. The older gentleman went on, his voice painting the scene for everyone listening. She led her team through the worst of the storm. They had to abandon their vehicles halfway and proceed on foot because of the mud. The whole time, they were carrying medical equipment and supplies. When they reached the facility, they found the situation was even worse than reported. The building had taken structural damage from the storm. An elderly passenger wiped her eyes quietly. The businessman's hand had moved to his chest, where his own daughter's photo rested in his wallet. The staff sergeant organized everyone into groups. She had them move the critical patients first, using makeshift stretchers in the mud. She stationed her team members at strategic points to ensure everyone's safety. When one of the doctors slipped and sprained his ankle, she carried him herself for over a mile. The cabin was completely silent now, every passenger absorbed in the tale. Even the flight attendants had paused their preparations, standing respectfully at the edges of the cabin. The young girl, the one who needed surgery, the older gentleman's voice softened. She was terrified of the thunder. So while carrying her stretcher, the staff sergeant taught her to count between the lightning and the thunder, turning it into a game to keep her calm. That child held onto her hand the entire way back to base. The businessman looked down at his hands, then at his first-class seat, seeming to realize how trivial his earlier complaints had been. By the time they got everyone to safety, the older gentleman concluded the staff sergeant and her team were covered in mud, soaked to the bone, and exhausted. But all 12 people survived. The young girl got her surgery. The doctors and nurses were safe. Not a single life was lost. He turned to face the staff sergeant directly. That mission became a textbook example of leadership and courage under extreme conditions. We still use it in training scenarios at the academy. The staff sergeant finally spoke, her voice humble. "We were just doing our job, sir. Any one of our servicemen or women would have done the same." A quiet moment followed her words. The businessman stood up slowly from his seat. His face had completely transformed from his earlier haughty expression. He looked at the staff sergeant, then at his own seat, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I believe I owe you an apology. Would you consider switching seats with me? Mine has a better view of the sunrise during takeoff." The genuine regret in his voice was clear to everyone listening. The genuine kindness in her voice seemed to affect the businessman more than any harsh words could have. He swallowed hard, straightening his tie in what appeared to be a nervous gesture. The other passengers watched as this moment of tension transformed into something unexpected, a chance for understanding and growth. The flight attendant moved through the first-class cabin with calm professionalism, his Navy uniform crisp and neat. His name tag caught the light as he approached the tense scene. He'd been working flights for over 15 years, and something in his expression showed he'd seen situations like this before. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The businessman immediately turned to him, speaking quickly and gesturing at the staff sergeant with his hand. "There seems to be a mix-up with the seating arrangements," he said, his tone suggesting he expected immediate action in his favor. The flight attendant looked at the staff sergeant, his eyes showing respect as they noted her uniform and the medals that decorated it. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" he asked politely. The staff sergeant handed it over without a word, her composure unchanged despite the uncomfortable situation. The businessman crossed his arms, tapping his expensive watch impatiently. "I've been flying first class for years," he repeated, as if this fact alone should settle the matter. "There must be some mistake. Perhaps there's been a computer error." The flight attendant studied the boarding pass carefully, though it was clear he'd already made up his mind. Around them, other passengers watched the scene unfold. A young girl in row 2 tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering questions about why the man was being mean to the soldier. "Everything appears to be in order," the flight attendant announced clearly, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "The staff sergeant is indeed assigned to seat 3A. Our airline has a policy of occasionally upgrading active military personnel as a small token of gratitude for their service." The businessman's face flushed deeper red. He began, but the flight attendant wasn't finished. His voice took on a warmer tone as he turned to the staff sergeant. "Thank you for your service, ma'am. Can I help you with your bag?" Just then, a deep voice spoke up from a few rows ahead. "Excuse me." All heads turned to see an older gentleman rising from his seat. He walked with the distinct bearing of someone who had spent many years in military service. His casual clothes couldn't hide his commanding presence. "I couldn't help but overhear," the older man said, approaching their group. "I believe I might be able to add some context to this situation." He turned to address the businessman directly, his voice carrying the weight of authority without being aggressive. "You see, I was fortunate enough to witness this staff sergeant's work firsthand during a joint operation in Afghanistan." The cabin grew even quieter as he spoke. "She led a medical evacuation mission under heavy fire that saved 12 lives, both military personnel and civilians." The businessman's expression began to shift as the older man continued. "One of those civilians was a young girl, about the same age as your daughter there in the photo." He nodded toward the businessman's phone, which still showed a family photo on its screen. The flight attendant stepped back slightly, allowing this moment to unfold. Other passengers had completely abandoned any pretense of not listening. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The young girl who had been whispering to her mother now watched with wide-eyed attention. "The staff sergeant didn't just save lives that day," the older man continued. "She showed extraordinary leadership in a situation where many would have faltered. She put herself at risk to ensure everyone made it home safely." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If anyone deserves a comfortable seat on this flight, it's her." The cabin remained silent for a moment after he finished speaking. The businessman looked down at his shoes, then at his phone, anywhere but at the staff sergeant or the older gentleman. The weight of his earlier behavior seemed to be settling on his shoulders. The flight attendant cleared his throat softly. "Sir," he addressed the businessman, "would you like to return to your seat? We'll be beginning our boarding process for the remaining passengers soon." The businessman nodded slowly, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. But before he could move, the staff sergeant spoke up for the first time since the older gentleman's intervention. Her voice was clear and carried no hint of anger or resentment. "Thank you for your concern about the seating arrangement," she said to the businessman. "I understand it might have seemed unusual. Perhaps during the flight, I could tell you more about our military's appreciation programs and the wonderful support we receive from many airlines." The staff sergeant made her way down the jet bridge, her carry-on bag light against her shoulder. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries drifted from the first-class cabin as she approached the aircraft door. The flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile and a sincere "thank you for your service" as she checked her boarding pass. Walking into the first-class cabin felt like entering a different world. Soft leather seats, extra legroom, and the quiet hum of peaceful conversation filled the space. She found her seat number and double-checked her ticket, 3A, window seat, just as the gate agent had promised. After months of military transport flights where comfort was the last priority, this felt almost unreal. But as she started to move toward her assigned seat, a man in an expensive charcoal suit blocked her path. He looked up from his phone, his eyes moving from her face to her uniform, then back to her face. His expression changed from surprise to disapproval in a matter of seconds. The businessman, probably in his 50s with graying hair and designer glasses, spoke loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made several passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "This is the first-class cabin." He emphasized the words first class as if explaining something to a child. The staff sergeant felt her cheeks warm up, but years of military training had taught her to keep her composure in challenging situations. She politely pulled out her boarding pass again, even though she had already memorized every detail on it. "No mistake, sir. Seat 3A." Her voice was calm and professional, just as it had been during countless mission briefings. But the businessman wasn't finished. He stood up straighter, adjusting his expensive tie. "Look," he said, lowering his voice but not his condescension, "I fly first class twice a week. I know the usual clientele." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Perhaps you misread your ticket. Economy class is that way." He gestured toward the back of the plane with a manicured hand. The other passengers in first class had gone quiet. Some pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines, while others watched the scene unfold with uncomfortable expressions. A young woman in seat 4B had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. The staff sergeant took a deep breath, remembering the countless times she'd faced much more dangerous situations. She had led missions under enemy fire, coordinated emergency medical evacuations, and made split-second decisions that saved lives. This man's prejudice, while painful, was nothing compared to what she overcome. "Sir," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your concern, but this is indeed my assigned seat." The airline occasionally upgrades active service members as a gesture of appreciation. She held out her boarding pass again, this time more firmly. The businessman's face reddened, but he wasn't backing down. He reached for his own phone, making a show of scrolling through his airline membership status. "I've been a platinum member for 15 years, he announced to no one in particular. "I've never heard of such a policy. I think we should get the flight attendant to sort this out." The tension in the cabin was palpable. A businessman across the aisle had stopped pretending to read his newspaper and was watching openly now. An elderly couple a few rows ahead were whispering to each other, shooting disapproving looks at the man in the charcoal suit. The staff sergeant stood her ground, her posture perfect, just as it had been during countless inspections. She thought about her unit back in Afghanistan, about the diverse group of people who had become her family over the past 18 months. They had learned to look past their differences and trust each other with their lives. How strange it felt to face such blatant prejudice here in the comfort of a first-class cabin. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, movement at the front of the cabin caught everyone's attention. A flight attendant was making his way toward them, having noticed the commotion. Behind him, another passenger had stood up, someone whose presence would change the entire dynamic of this confrontation. The businessman smirked slightly, clearly expecting the flight attendant to resolve the situation in his favor. Little did he know that the next few minutes would not only prove him wrong, but would also become a powerful lesson in respect, dignity, and the true meaning of service to one's country. The tension in the cabin had reached its peak, and as the flight attendant approached, even the passengers who had been pretending not to notice were now watching intently. This moment was about to become much more than a simple seating dispute. It would turn into a story that would touch hearts and change minds. The early morning sun streamed through the large terminal windows at Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. A female staff sergeant stood quietly by the boarding gate, her military uniform pressed to perfection and her combat boots shining under the fluorescent lights. She watched families hugging goodbye and business travelers rushing past with their rolling suitcases, while her own heart beat with excitement about finally heading home. After spending 18 long months in Afghanistan, where every day brought new challenges and the weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, she could hardly believe she was finally going home. Her fingers kept touching the first-class ticket in her pocket, a surprise upgrade the airline had given her as part of their military appreciation program. It was a small gesture, but it meant so much after countless nights spent in rough military bunkers and endless days of desert heat. The staff sergeant smiled softly as she remembered how she hadn't told her family she was coming home. In her mind, she could already picture their faces when she'd show up at their doorstep. Her mom would probably cry, she always did. Her dad would try to hide his tears, he never succeeded, and her little brother would probably tackle her with one of his famous bear hugs that nearly squeezed the life out of her. As she waited by the gate, she noticed other travelers stealing glances at her uniform. Some nodded respectfully, while others came up to thank her for her service. An elderly woman even insisted on buying her a coffee, sharing stories about her own husband who had served in Vietnam. The staff sergeant listened warmly, appreciating these little moments of connection that reminded her why she'd chosen to serve her country in the first place. The memories of her time in Afghanistan flashed through her mind, the intense heat that made every breath feel like fire, the strong bonds she'd formed with her unit members, and the local children who would wave excitedly whenever they passed through villages. She remembered the challenging missions, the lives they'd saved, and the moments of both triumph and heartbreak that had shaped her service. Her thoughts were interrupted by the gate agent's announcement that first-class boarding would begin soon. She gathered her small carry-on bag, containing just a few precious items, some photos, her favorite book, now worn from multiple readings, and a small stuffed animal a young Afghan girl had given her for good luck. Everything else she owned was being shipped separately. As she stood in line, checking her boarding pass one more time, she couldn't help but overhear conversations around her. Business people discussed their important meetings, families debated about vacation plans, and a couple argued quietly about their seating arrangement. It all felt so wonderfully normal after months of military precision and protocol. The staff sergeant took a deep breath, taking in this moment of transition. She was leaving behind the structured military life she'd known for the past 18 months and stepping back into the civilian world. The first-class upgrade felt like a perfect symbol of this change, a bridge between her military service and her return home. Just then, the gate agent called for first-class passengers to begin boarding. As the staff sergeant stepped forward, her boots making a soft clicking sound against the floor, she felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Pride in her service, excitement about going home, and a touch of nervousness about what awaited her. Little did she know that this flight would become much more than just a journey home. It would become a moment that would touch many lives and spark an important conversation about respect, dignity, and understanding. She adjusted her uniform one last time, squared her shoulders, a habit that had become second nature, and walked toward the jet bridge. The morning sun caught her service medals, making them glint briefly, like little stars on her chest. As she approached the aircraft door, she couldn't possibly have known that the next few hours would turn into a story that would inspire thousands of people across the country.